Hello, and thank you for watching. This is Jackson Bleacher's College Football Best for Week 7. It's Thursday afternoon. College football games. I think we got TCU, Texas Tech tonight, and it'll kick off in a little under 4 hours. Before we take a look at this week's slate of games, let's take a quick look back at last week, which was by far the worst year of the season for me. We went 0-4 with a bad beat and 3 blowouts. But even with the bad week last week, we're still 13-9-1 on the year, so still a very profitable year. Going back to last week, Syracuse had the best chance of at least somewhat salvaging the weekend, but they did turn the ball over in overtime to end that game, and they lost to Pitt. To be honest, they completely deserved to lose. Pitt's not very good and should have had no chance of beating Syracuse, but they tried to sleepwalk their way to a win at Heinz Field, and it blew up in their face. Some of the other games, the other three were just bad. Stanford, Auburn, and Navy, all three probably played their worst games of the season. They all three should have won and won big, and none of them were even able to keep it within single digits. But again, even that's going to happen. We were hot. You're going to have some bad luck weekends, and even with that bad weekend, we're still 13-9-1 on the year. So hopefully we'll pick up a couple wins this week and stay profitable. So we'll get to the games, this week's games. We're going to start out with Texas A&M -2 at South Carolina. A few days ago, looked like the weather might be a factor. That weather should be pushed out now. I know should be clear of South Carolina, and by kickoff, it's definitely going to be fine. It's going to be sunny and 75, but the biggest weather concern left as of a couple of days ago is would A&M be able to still get there on time. I think that's fine now. I don't expect A&M to have any problems with weather getting into Columbia, but if they do, that changes everything. But we're gonna roll with it like they're not. So assuming the weather does cooperate, A&M should have no problems with South Carolina. Aggies are coming off a really big home win over Kentucky, which didn't seem like it would mean hardly anything a month ago. But Kentucky has been surprisingly good, one of the better surprises of the year, surprising in a good way anyway. And they right now look like they may be the second team in the SEC East. You could also make a case for Florida, which we'll get there in a minute. But right now, Kentucky, they definitely, you could definitely argue that they're the second best team in the East for sure. But A&M was blown out in Tuscaloosa against Alabama, but they more than held their own against Clemson. And who hasn't been blown out against Alabama? And to go back to that game, they did cover the spread. So nobody should hold that blowout loss at Alabama against them because Alabama's going to destroy everybody. A&M does have one of the best rush defenses in the country, and that's even with them having to play Bama and Clemson already. South Carolina's quarterback Jake Bentley is expected to start, but you never know. He may have to rely on the run game even more than normal, which is definitely not an ideal situation when you're playing a good rush defense like Texas A&M. Carolina and A&M both have a common opponent this season, but they both had completely different results. As we've already mentioned, that opponent is Kentucky. Texas A&M beat them at home last week. It did take overtime, but it should have never gone to overtime. South Carolina got throttled by that same Kentucky team a couple of weeks ago in Lexington. And you never want to read too much into one game, but I don't think that's a coincidence. I think A&M's the better team, and they've proved it on the field so far this season. According to OddsShark, Texas A&M is 6-1 against the spread in its last 7 games, and 4-2 against the spread in its last 6 road games. South Carolina is 4-2 against the spread in its last 6 games, and 8-2 straight up in the last 10 games at Williams-Brice. So something's going to give here. I think the eye test alone is going to tell you that A&M's the better team, and the stats kind of back it up too. Yeah, Carolina has the advantage of playing home, but I don't think it'll be enough for them to keep within a field goal. Take Texas A&M -2. So the second game, Florida -7 at Vandy. So we're going to keep it in the SEC for this second pick. The Gators head to Nashville as a touchdown favorite, and I think that's a little too low. Florida is definitely the better team, and I'm not real sure why they're only laying a touchdown. The Gators are coming off the biggest win of the season last week beating LSU at the Swamp. And before that, Dan Mullen's new team went down to Starkville and took out his old team, Mississippi State. An early loss to Kentucky, which at the time looked really bad, but now it does not look too bad now with as well as Kentucky's played. But that early loss to them is making it hard for the Gators to get the respect they probably deserve. If you throw the Kentucky game out, which I mean obviously you can't, you would be able to argue that Florida could be in the top 5. But I mean that's the beauty of college football. One bad game can wreck your season. That's why every game's so important. Florida's better than they are getting respect for it. I mean I'm part of the problem there. I thought Florida was terrible. I overreacted to that Florida loss. A couple of their non-conference games they didn't play great, but since they went to Knoxville to play Tennessee, they've looked like a completely different team. Yeah, Tennessee's not very good, but they beat Mississippi State and they beat LSU, so they've beaten some decent teams. Vanderbilt, on the other hand, hasn't been bad this season really, and really they started off amazing. They took care of 2 pretty decent Group of 5 teams in Middle Tennessee and Nevada to start the season, and they even gave Notre Dame all they could handle in South Bend. But since then, Vandy's kind of looked like Vandy. The downfall started a few weeks ago when a very mediocre South Carolina team rolled the doors in Nashville. And the next week after that, Vandy struggled to beat Tennessee State, and then they followed that with a big time loss at Georgia last week. But to be fair to Vandy, there aren't too many teams that are going to be able to keep it close against Georgia on the road, so you don't really want to hold that one against them. But they have, if you look more than just that game, they haven't been the same team. They don't look like the same team that took the field the first few weeks of the season. I kind of expect Florida to get away with this game, kind of run away with it by halftime. And the only way I can see Vandy hanging around is if Florida has a little bit of a hangover game from last week, upsetting LSU. I mean, if you just kind of glance at it, it is set up as somewhat of a trap game for Florida because it's sandwiched between LSU and Georgia. But Florida has a bye week, so I think that open date next week will kind of help keep Florida players' minds off of the Georgia game and on Vanderbilt a little more than if they were playing that Georgia game next week instead of the week after. You can look at the trends, and they definitely favor Florida. The Gators have beaten Vanderbilt 22 out of the last 23 games, and Vandy is just 5-9-1 against the spread in the last 15 games according to OddsShark. Florida, on the other hand, is 5-1 against the spread in its last 6 games and 4-2 straight up in its last 6 road games. Don't overthink this one. It's still Florida and Vanderbilt. Take the Gators -7. Final game of the weekend, I'm going Central Florida -4.5 at Memphis. Everybody remembers UCF's magical and almost playoff-worthy season from last year. And in case you just kind of quit checking on them after Scott Frost left, they haven't lost. Their winning streak is still alive. I believe it's at 18 games now, and they will put it on the line Saturday afternoon in Memphis. So the Knights beat Memphis and Orlando twice last season, but that AAC championship game might have been the most entertaining game of the entire 2017 season. Both teams are missing key pieces from last year's squad, but Memphis seems to have been more bothered by it. The Tigers are 3-2, but all 3 of their wins were blowouts against really bad teams, and they all 3 came at the Liberty Bowl. Memphis got embarrassed by Tulane in New Orleans 2 weeks ago on national television, and they also lost a game they probably should have won at Navy. The Knights are 5-0, but they haven't really played anyone, but they also haven't had much of a test in terms of scoreboard pressure yet either. Don't expect either defense to have a great day. The over-under for this game is 81 points, and 64% of the money is on the over. UCF has only failed to reach 45 points once this year, and that was an early season blowout win over South Carolina Upstate. I believe that was 38-0 was scoring that one. They've topped the 50-point mark twice this season at Florida Atlantic and at home against SMU. But the Tigers know how to light up the scoreboard too, especially at home. They've scored more than 50 in all 4 games at the Liberty Bowl this season, including a 66-point explosion against Mercer on opening night. It is worth pointing out, though, that the level of competition the Tigers have faced, especially at the Liberty Bowl, has been very low. But if you haven't seen Memphis play yet this season, you should make it a point to watch Darrell Henderson. He's probably the best player nobody's ever heard of. And the Tigers running back has 934 yards and 12 touchdowns just on the ground already this season. And add those insane numbers to his 2 receiving touchdowns, and you would have a legitimate Heisman candidate at any Power 5 school in the country. But he goes to Memphis, so he's relatively unheard of among most college football fans. With all the positives the Tigers offense have going for them, I don't see them hanging with Central Florida. Many people like Memphis to get some revenge for last season, but I just don't see it happening. This is the same team that got throttled by Tulane in New Orleans. UCF don't look like they've missed a beat since last year. Take Central Florida -4.5. So we'll run through these real fast one more time. First game, Texas A&M -2 at South Carolina. Second game, Florida -7 at Vandy. In the third game, Central Florida -4.5 at Memphis. So those are our 3 games. I mean, it's going to be hard to be any worse than last week, but even with last week's 0-4, we're still very much positive on the season. Still 4 games over 500 with a push. So still very much profitable season. Let's get a couple more wins this week. And as always, be watching all the way through kickoff Saturday. Be watching on Twitter at Jackson Bleacher. I'll put the link in the description. But for any more updates, any changes, or any games to add. But thank you for watching, and let's pick up some wins this weekend.